Hello everyone, lecture number 9 in a series of lectures entitled Thought as Word Dynamics. This is artificial intelligence. It is very much the ideas I developed initially back in 1987 to 1990 when I worked for British Telecom within the framework of a Connex project, artificial intelligence project, which was quite innovative in those years. I developed on my own, but with the kind support of people around me, ANELA, Associative Network with Emergent Logical and Learning Abilities. In that series of lectures, I've established so far, with a lot of supportive argument, that there's a network in our brain. No, I'm joking. We know that there is a network in our brains. But what is probably a new idea, something a bit original, is that the idea that in a bottom-up approach, as the one I developed with ANELA, as opposed to a top-down approach like we see currently in large language models, it is probably a good idea to imagine, a plausible idea and a quite effective one, to imagine that what is stored in the brain through Hebbian reinforcement, like I discussed in lecture number 8, is word pairs of words being associated, being linked, being, how would I say, soldered together by sharing a same emotional or affective value. Why emotional value? But that's because that's the way that through gradient descent we'll be producing sentences, either in inner speech, talking to other people, writing things down, etc. We've reached the point where we start thinking really about these word pairs and how should they be implemented in the network, which will be a model for the way that we proceed. I've underlined that this idea of that the elementary unit of meaning is not an individual word, but a pair of words, was introduced by a certain philosopher called Aristotle in his Organon, a series of texts which are devoted to what we would call together logic, linguistics, pragmatics, philosophy, whatever, which is a bit what I'm doing currently, which is a mixture of philosophy, linguistics, artificial intelligence, which was not the case at the time of in the days of Aristotle, because machines were nowhere compared to what they are now. This lecture, it will be the first part of a lecture entitled The Network Has Two Principles of Organization, Hereditary and Endogenous, and I'll say a lot more about that. The first part of that chapter is dealing with the way that the Chinese have approached this idea of word pairs. In the second part, which will come at lecture number 10, we'll be dealing with the ancient Greek way, in particular that of Aristotle, the way he approached that. But the Chinese, independently and at about the same time, archaic Chinese thought, have developed very interesting views about how to deal with this discussions around debates, around logical problems that were stated in the Chinese way as very much in very different way than the Greek approach these kind of issues, different types of paradoxes, different types of puzzles. Today, the Chinese way. So, as I said, what we're dealing with here today is not particularly artificial intelligence, except it's what I'm trying to establish is a toolbox for doing artificial intelligence with better tools than those that had been developed recently. And in particular, I would say that cognitive sciences, psychology. That's enough for the tools I need, and that's the way. That's the reason why I turn to psychoanalysis. And when dealing with linguistics, I turn back to the medieval linguists rather than the current ones. The Chinese way: penetrable versus impenetrable. I'll tell more what it is about. First, in order to make things understandable, I read once again the definition that that Aristotle gave to what he called his categories. And his categories, as I said, is to define what are the elementary units of meaning, which are word pairs. This is what Aristotle says in the books, which is called Categories, and a category is and that's the way that the notion was introduced in philosophy and in linguistics and in pragmatics, if you will. It was developed in a book which is called Categories. And what are the categories? These are the 10 ways of making word pairs. I read again from this is from the text from Aristotle. I open the quotes. I'll tell you when I'll close them. Expressions which are in no way composite signify substance, quantity, quality, relation, place, time, position, state, action, or affection. To sketch my meaning roughly, examples of substance are man or the horse, of quantity such terms as 2 cubits long or 3 cubits long, a cubit being a unit of measure in ancient Greece. Of quality, such attributes as white, grammatical. Fall under the category of relation: double, half, greater. Fall in the category of place: at the marketplace, in the Lyceum. Under the category of time: yesterday, last year. Lying, sitting are terms indicating position. Shod, armed indicate state. To lance, to cauterize indicate action. To be lanced, to be cauterized indicate affection. No one of these terms in and by itself involves an affirmation. It is by the combination of such terms that positive or negative statements arise. For every assertion must, as is admitted, be either true or false, whereas expressions which are in no way composite, such as man, white, runs, wins, cannot be either true or false. The reason why we need to think of word pairs as being the elementary units is that of a word pair we can say it is true or it is not. If we say man, you can't say that whether that's true or not. If you say talking about a particular man, that man is blind, it's true or false. If you say in general man, meaning humankind, or mammals, it's true or false. In this particular case, it is true. So these are the categories, the 10 ways of looking at things, which make it possible to associate some words together in 2 word pairs, being the elementary unit of meaning in Aristotle, elementary units for logic, as they can be true or false, and elementary units of mnesic traces is, as far as I'm concerned, as the elementary units of what is being embedded, written into the brain, into that network which we have in our skull, within the skull. This is not the way, of course, that large language models approach language. It's a different way. But a network is a flexible enough tool that information can be distributed within it, either in a totally distributed, meaning in a way that doesn't mean it make any sense if you open the hood and try to look at the black box which is there, or maybe if you open the hood and things have been written inside in a way which is readable, which is the approach of Anella that I developed in the late 80s, then you can look at it and see within that network notions being attached to at particular places. What are these categories? Some people hold that they exist in the physical world. According to them, these 10 manners of making word pairs reflect the way the word presents itself to our senses. That's one way of thinking of this. Aristotelian categories, this is the way, it's physics. That's the way that the word looks, because that's the way it's actually being constituted. Some have said instead that the categories reflect the way our mind operates, which is a different notion. Well, we are part of the world, but it may be that we have a grid of looking at things which may be proper to us, which doesn't reflect so much the physical nature of the word, but the way that we interpret it. And the view is ancient, because it's the philosopher Sextus Empiricus already said that these categories reflect the way that our mind operates. But some others hold that the categories simply reflect the grammar of the ancient Greek language. And that was very much a very popular view in the 19th century, developed by a German philosopher called Trendelenburg. The French linguist Émile Benveniste in the 1950s, 60s held a similar view, that Aristotle's categories reflect the language, the Greek language, and nothing more. Whatever the case, one of these categories has a sure footing in the physical world, the category of substance. There are two aspects to a substance: its matter and its shape, and that was already said by Aristotle. Aristotle distinguishes what he called primary substances and secondary substances. Primary substances are particular entities such as individual man or horses. He gave man and horse as the example. Secondary substances are such as the species or the genera wherein primary substances are included. Iron is a primary substance, metal a secondary substance. All other categories are present in a subject, and some asserted of a subject, as Aristotle states it. Sometimes it's also said that the species is the primary substance and the genus the secondary. Oscar is a man, primary substance of Oscar, and an animal as a secondary substance of Oscar, a wider category within which he's been included. In any particular location, there can only be one primary substance at the time. If Peter is sitting on the chair, Paul can sit on his knees, but he can't sit at the very same location as Paul. Unlike what happens with primary substances, there is no difficulty in bringing together various secondary substances within the same physical location. When Oscar is alone in the kitchen, there is still there simultaneously a man, a biped, a mammal, a vertebrate, an animal, and a creature. No difficulty of... there can only be one Oscar at a particular location in the kitchen, but with that Oscar comes a number of secondary substances, to use the vocabulary of Tom. Distinguish things between penetrable and impenetrable was central to archaic Chinese thought, and that's why I'll be talking about the penetrable and the impenetrable. And before I go in there, I need to say that the French mathematician René Thom, famous for having invented and developed catastrophe theory, he has proposed in his times, he's dead now, a semiophysics, where the concepts of pregnancy and saliency are central. These correspond, broadly speaking, to penetrable and impenetrable in the Chinese ancient thought. I've got no idea whether Tom was aware of that, or whether it was simply his reflections on catastrophes, on the ways that, the way that physical objects can decay and break, whether that's what led him to introduce these notions of pregnancy and saliency, which reproduce purely and simply those of penetrable and impenetrable in ancient thought. I quote a quite long passage from René Thom, from his text of his Semiophysics of 1988. It is therefore possible to regard a pregnancy as an invasive type of fluid that spreads within the field of the salient forms perceived. The salient forms are these impenetrable things, like substance. What he called the pregnancies is these other categories which can be put, quite a large number of them can be put at the same place at the same time. And therefore he says that they spread like a fluid, where different coatings can be put on the same objects. I'll say more from what he says there. It is therefore possible to regard a pregnancy as an invasive type of fluid that spreads within the field of the salient forms perceived. The salient form, the substance in Aristotle's terms, playing the role of a crack in reality through which the invasive fluid of the pregnancy percolates. Such propagation takes place under two modes: propagation through contiguity and propagation through similitude, by things being close to each other, either in time or in space, or in time and space at the same time, or through propagation, what he called propagation through similitude, because they look like each other. Tom adds, which is the way that Sir James Frazer in The Golden Bough classified the magical actions of primitive men. Contiguity and similitude enlist the respective topology and geometry of a macroscopic space. Seen this way, there is in Pavlovian conditioning an underlying geometric base. So this idea of stimulus response, which is basic to any Pavlovian approach, which in my mind splits then later on between the behaviorism of Skinner and the psychoanalysis of Freud. What Tom is saying there is that in this Pavlovian stimulus response scheme, there is something which is in the nature of things, which is an underlying geometric base. But let's get back to Chinese thought. In Chinese thought, there would be legitimate ways for combining the penetrable and the impenetrable, like stone and hard, but also the impenetrable with the impenetrable, like what happens in Western thought, would be the way that broader types, high-level concepts are created. I can say a rose is blue, it has many petals, it is here, it is here today, and so on. I can go doing that forever. I've got one impenetrable thing, which is the rose, and then I can stick together, coat it with a number of penetrable ideas, which, as Tom says, like a fluid, come around and wet, I would say wet, the substance underneath. The Chinese do the following, and they can indeed take a substance, impenetrable, and put penetrables on top. But they also, in Chinese classical thought, in any case, they can put some impenetrables together in order to create a higher order category. I'll give an example for that. For instance, ox-horse allows to compose the concept of traction animals. You say ox and horse, and then there must be something in common. There must be some intersection between the two notions, as you would say in set theory, and that creates the notion of animals that can track a vehicle like a car or something of some type. Another way is saying water mountain. You say water and mountain, and you create in Chinese the category of nature, which encompasses, of course, water on one side, like lakes and oceans, seas, and on the other side, mountains, hills, and so on. One can add up two impenetrable names to make a superordinate category in ancient Chinese, like I just gave two examples of. A classical paradox of early Chinese logic, Kung Sun Lun's claim that white horse is no horse derives from the suggestion that higher level concept can derive similarly from combining penetrable and impenetrable. What Kung Sun Lun was suggesting, and nobody believed it, it was a paradox in the Chinese thought, is that you could take an impenetrable like a horse, and you could use a penetrable like white, and try to make a super category like horse, and that's where the paradox derived from. The main authors who have analyzed that, and when I talked about that, I only summarized what they were saying, essentially, Chad Hansen and A.C. Graham. I've added a little element to it when I talked about that white horse paradox. Aristotle's category of substance is impenetrable. It acts as a substrate whereupon all the other categories can apply as so many coatings of time, place, number, quality, etc. Without any of these getting in the way of any others, you can add these things all together. The primary category of substance is the substratum presupposed by all the others. These other 9 categories are penetrables, and as far as those are concerned, there is no obstacle to piling them up on top of each other. When I say that violets are blue, nothing prevents me indeed from saying at the same time that violets are fragrant or that violets are pretty. It is true that I cannot put the impenetrables violet and rose at the very same place at the very same time, but I can do so with no difficulty with penetrables such as blueness, prettiness, or fragrance, as long as the violet remains a substrate, the primary substance that allows them to do so. Primary substrates, the impenetrable, and secondary substances, which are the penetrables in ancient Chinese thought. Next lecture, number 10, we'll go back to Aristotle and we'll go to his distinction, his way of going through this, which is not so much in terms of substances, because he will apply it to all categories by looking at things as being essential or accidental. Okay, thank you so much. I'll see you soon. Thank you for your attention. Bye-bye.